Ladies and gentlemen, it's really a pleasure and honor to be here. First time I came here to Edmonton was 34 years ago. The Soviet Union was still existing, and this was still snowing. So nothing really changed at this time. I was enjoyed, surprised, shocked, whatever the right words, by the amazement, achievements by the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. My generation, so I'm not young then anymore, but in the 80s, 90s, we're still much younger. We learn a lot, actually. We didn't have the proper education in the Soviet system, so the production of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies books was there the second university. I should say, through the university, I have read first my time Ivan Lysak-Rudinski essays, which changed my life, as many other historians in Ukraine. So to make the long story short, I'm very thankful, grateful for your work, for your invitation. It's really an honor. Also, thank you for this business, Ukrainian Canadian Professional Association, for having me here. As you could easily imagine, that English is not my native language, and actually I'm just surprised by your choice of me. I am not good as a lecture presentation. I'm speaking too fast. I'm stammering. I'm glossing. I'm skipping the words and the vowels. So actually, I feel sorry for you. Because the longer I will speak, the less comprehensible I will become. I'll promise you. My students know that Hrytsak is better to be read than heard. That for my excuse, I can tell you a short anecdote. You probably know there was a rather famous Polish king, 𝗍𝗂𝘁𝗀 of Ukrainian origin. He was known by the fact that he spoke fluently 8 languages. There was only one problem with him. He has nothing to tell any of these languages. So I believe I have something to tell, and this will probably send as excuse to my lecture. And that you see the topic is the when and why Putin decided to attack Ukraine, because I believe the timing is very important. And I would probably start with the quotation from Oxford professor 𝗍𝗂𝘁𝗁. I bet that many of you know him. He is very supportive of Ukraine. By the way, a year ago or so, he got a prize from Canadian institution, and he gave this prize to one of the Ukrainian military units. So basically, he's very much engaged in Canadian issues. And you probably read his recent book. If not, I strongly recommend. The book is called Homelands. And this guy provides a new perspective of the most recent history. And actually, you could easily guess that Ukraine is featuring there. So he has an essay on Ukrainian war. And this war, in this essay, he's talking about this fixed experience when he met Putin. And Putin shocked him. It was 1994. And this was a conference in St. Petersburg. And this usually happens, conference may be very boring, so he fell asleep. And then he got quite woke up. He woke up by the appearance, as he said, a short, thick-set man with an unpleasant, vaguely red-like face. And this man started talking something which made him wake up, because basically what he said, and this is, I'm quoting, "We must remember," he said, "that there are territories now outside the frontiers of the Russian Federation that historically always belonged to Russia. Some 25 million Russians had suddenly found themselves outside her motherland, and Russia has a duty to care toward them. The international community must recognize such justified interest of the Russian state, of the Russian people as a great nation." 20 years later, 𝗍𝗂𝘁𝗁 wrote, "In March 2014, this man stood before the ecstatic audience in Kremlin to celebrate Russia annexation." And you could easily guess the man was Vladimir Putin. 𝗍𝗂𝘁𝗁 makes a very good point, that in war, like in romance, the beginnings are very important, because they basically define the further developments, including the final stage. So now the point is, when Putin started thinking about Ukraine, and more particularly started thinking about Ukraine as a possible object of aggression. There are many discussions about the things. And recently, a few months ago, Russian opposition journalists have unearthed a video, which is rather unknown, a video that was taken at the last month of the Soviet Union. It was an interview of Putin, dated by fall 1991. At that time, he was 39, deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, and recently appointed head of Foreign Relations Committee. Here's a screenshot from this video. He looks not that nice. He never was nice, but much younger. And there was a particular moment, a episode of this video, that deserves a special attention. A day before the interview, the video crew noticed a small bronze statue of Lenin in his office. And on the next day, when they came to talk with Putin, the figure has gone. So they asked Putin what happened to the bronze statue of Lenin. He pretended to be unaware and says something to the effect that figure has been removed by his assistant without his knowledge. And this minor incident made him to discuss his personal attitude toward Lenin. So he said, and here is what I found, the transcription of his interview, that the revolution of 1917, he meant Lenin Bolsheviks, were responsible for tragedy we experience today. They cut the country up into republics that didn't exist before, and then destroyed what unites the people or civilized countries. So what I'm saying here, this is fall 1991, the Soviet Union is still existing, and he was already giving the idea, exploring the idea that he will later say that he will announce the war of Ukraine, because exactly this is the point. Because this, when he announced in Ukraine, this his famous, rather unfamous speech that legitimized his military aggression, he referred that Ukraine is an artificial nation created by Lenin, and the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy. So we have already that time on this early interview of 1991. In this interview in 1991, he didn't mention specifically Ukraine. He just hinted that Ukraine may be one of the countries. But who mentioned Ukraine, however, was his boss. Those who was born in Soviet Union or spend the time, they may easily recognize this man. He's Anatoly Sobchak. He was a very famous man at the time of the Gorbachev. He's probably second the most popular person in Soviet Union to Yeltsin. So at that time, Anatoly Sobchak was mayor of St. Petersburg, and Putin was vice mayor. In 1992 interview, Sobchak overtly expressed his disgust with Ukraine. Especially, he claimed that Ukraine could manage to build a powerful army, it would pose a danger to the whole world. As I said, at this time, Sobchak was one of the most known political figures in post-communist Russia, probably second to Boris Yeltsin only. And in 1991, together with Yeltsin, Sobchak actively opposed the communist coup d'etat. And Sobchak was described as a godfather of the Russian democracy, and he himself boasted that it was him who made Putin. At least he brought him to power. These facts serve us to remind us some crucial facts of the Putin biography that are quite often ignored. We used to think about him as the former officer of KGB, which is true. But we, however, tend to forget that he started his political career in the milieu of the Russian anti-communist democratic opposition, with people like Yeltsin and Sobchak. You see him here. This is him. He was a special mission. He carried cases for Sobchak at that time. This was described that way, so to say. So he was not really kind of the high positions, but he was still his servant and loyal. My first claim is that before we start asking when Putin made his decision to attack Ukraine, we have to take into account the general atmosphere in which he started his political career. Unfortunately, we could not rely on the written documents because the important political decisions in Russia are rarely left any paper trail. There is such tradition which goes from the Soviet Union. There is exception, though. Last year, the White House declassified minutes of meetings of Boris Yeltsin, Russian president, with the two United States presidents, with George Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton. And what is important that in both these meetings, Ukraine featured very important place, has a very important place. So in his talk with Bush, Yeltsin saw Ukraine as the main destabilizing factor for Russia. Note the wording, the most stabilizing factor for Russia. But he believed at that time that Russian-Ukrainian issue could be resolved in a peaceful manner. And during his last meeting, Bill Clinton, it was Istanbul 1999, Yeltsin suggested that Russia and United States has to divide their sphere of influence, and Russia should take control of all over Europe. He asked or suggested Clinton to give Europe to Russia because Russia is in Europe and the United States is not. The Russian president said, and this is I'm quoting, you can take all the other states and provide security to them, and I will take Europe and provide them security. Yeltsin didn't mention specifically Ukraine, but he meant Ukraine as well because this is the closest neighboring country. This meeting also deserves special attention because it was held right before the 1999 elections, and in this meeting, Yeltsin announced that he declared the Putin as his ancestor, his successor, and Clinton took this choice very positively. This is the assumption that we have as documented studies. At least there's a few exceptions, because otherwise we have to rely on other sources. And the sources are, in most of the cases, they came from the people who know or knew Putin personally and rather closely. Some of them belong to the closest milieu of Putin. So to say, they have intimate knowledge of the nowadays Russian president. First of all, I want to draw attention to Andrei Illarionov. I believe that many of you know him. He was quite often commenting the Ukrainian issue. For 5 crucial years, from April 2000 to December 2005, Illarionov served as a senior police advisor to Putin. But then he resigned in the protest against the Putin politics and became a vocal critic of Putin and his regime, and finally left Russia for the United States. And now he's one of the leading experts on the Russian issues, United States. And a few months before the war, after the war, he gave a very large and detailed interview, by dates practically, in which he told us how the attitude of Putin evolved through this time, for 2000. Another important figure is 𝗨𝗶𝗶𝘀. 𝗨𝗨𝗶𝗀 was born in Odessa, in the Soviet Ukraine, in the 50s. In the 70s, when he was a student of the Odessa University, he participated in semi-dissident movements. He was arrested, but then was released and moved to Russia, to Moscow. But then, in the 1990s, he changed his kind of direction. He forgot about his kind of anti-communist past and became very close to Putin. And at some point, he was kind of the responsible for the Ukrainian politics of Russia, so to say, in this crucial year. Especially, he was very instrumental during Orange Revolution, 2014. Actually, he was one of the leading spin doctors of Ukraine before 𝗧𝗁𝘁𝗁𝗍𝗁. 2 years ago, a year after the Ukrainian-Russian war, he passed away. He has a cancer, terminal illness. He passed away. And before his death, he started talking and revealed a lot of information, what was going on in this milieu, in these exactly crucial years. And then there are memoirs recently published in Polish by Polish President Aleksander Kwaśniewski. They were published several months ago, and I met him personally. He told me the whole details, because he met Putin several times. Okay, when he was ending his term, it was the early 0 years, and there was very interesting details about this kind of the Putin attitude toward Ukraine already at the time. And finally, this name will be probably many recognized, is the former minister, not former, he's now actually, he was been former, now again, Minister of the Foreign Affairs, Polish Radek Sikorski, who made very interesting revelations, which has to disavow, and then again he just confirmed this was true, which is also relates to this plan over Putin toward the Western Ukraine. It's probably one of the most interesting parts. So what we have here, we have testimonies. Testimonies of people, this is oral testimonies, we could not be proved or disapproved by some documents. They provide some scraps information, but taken together, they help us to reconstruct some kind of general picture, which I believe sounds very truthful, so to say. So my first general claim is that there has been no single day which could be pinpointed as a moment when Putin made his decision to attack Ukraine. It was rather a gradual process. It was an evolution than a revolution. The choice of a date depends on what kind of war we're talking about. When we mean the current Russian-Ukrainian war, then decision was made during the fall of 2021, a few months before the real war started. When you're talking about annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass, Decision was made in late 2008, right after the Georgian-Russian war. And finally, when we discuss the hybrid war, which is informational war, trade, or gas war, we have to start with the first year of the Putin political career, which is the back time of the last days of the Soviet Union, and he's serving in the Sobchak office. Just let me reiterate the important fact. This Putin started his career in the Russian democratic milieu. And dominant mood in this milieu toward Ukraine was revealed several years ago by Alexander 𝗔𝘁𝗁, also a name that may be familiar to you. He was senior advisor to 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗶. By the way, he's also born in Odessa. He came from Odessa, and sometimes he made a very pro-Ukrainian statement, but it's very much ambivalent. So the thing is, 𝗔𝗁𝗁 tells an episode that occurred exactly at the eve of the breakup of the Soviet Union. It is November 1991. At that time, Ukraine was already proclaiming independence, but this will be confirmed, corroborated by the Ukrainian referendum. So Russian opposition, actually there was not opposition already in power because Putin, but Yeltsin by the time was already president, they had a long discussion what to do with Ukraine. Let me just remind you that moment was a particular moment because at that time Gorbachev was still president of the Soviet Union and Yeltsin was a president of Russia. There were two presidents in Moscow, one president too many, and they were fighting with each other. Actually, Yeltsin tried to remove Gorbachev out of office by helping to break up the Soviet Union, which is quite often forgotten. It was Russia. The Russian elites just tried to break up the Union for their own profit. So they have this discussion, and after the long discussion, they came to the conclusion that they would let Ukraine go, to leave Russia. But the reason was very important. Because, in their opinion, Ukraine was an artificial nation. The experiment with Ukrainian independence would not last long. Sooner or later, Ukraine as a state would collapse, and Ukraine will be coming back, but this time on her knees, begging to be accepted back. And this would allow Russian elites to dictate tougher conditions of the new Russian-Ukrainian reunion, so to say. So this is the premise. So what I'm saying here, the Russian elites from the very beginning never give a full consent to the existence of Ukraine as a separate nation. It was very conditional, on the conditions that Ukraine will keep that closer, as much closer to Russia, or even to make the union again. So, very important time. Time was very important, because what happened there, time was ticking, and Ukraine was not returning to Russia, neither standing on her knees. Very surprisingly, Ukraine turned to be a very stable community. Despite all this kind of the economic problems, political crisis, language divisions, Ukraine was remarkably stable. It was, so to say, shaking but not breaking. And probably the moment of stability was intensified with the next Ukrainian elections, when first Ukrainian President Kravchuk lost the elections and gave power peacefully to Leonid Kuchma. Let me just remind you that Leonid Kravchuk was from the western Ukraine, and Leonid Kuchma was from the eastern Ukraine, from Dnipro. So there was belief that once Kuchma will come to power, he will bring Ukraine to Russia as close as possible. Actually, this was Kuchma promised, and this is one of the reasons why we won these elections. And I remember very well that for us, victory of Kuchma was a kind of disaster. We really believed that Ukraine would lose its independence. I remember very well that the next day of Ukrainian elections, announcing the results, leading Polish newspaper, 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗶 came with an issue on the front page, "Goodbye Ukraine." It was exactly after victory of Lukashenko in Belarus. So there was belief that Ukraine would follow Belarus and the results would be not the best, so to say. And quite suddenly, Kuchma unexpectedly made a U-turn. U-turn also means Ukrainian turn, because he came to power from the Russian-speaking territories, but quite of a sudden he showed himself that he was very much Ukrainian patriot, and he did everything to stabilize Ukraine. Without a doubt, he did it in not the best way. It was him who probably was responsible for it, an oligarch system, corrupting state, all the kind of thing, because this is the way to keep the check and balances in Ukraine, say to make a compromise consent between different elites, regional elites in the country. But at the same time, at this very time, he started economic reforms, which worked very well. And since the end of the 90s, Ukraine started very economically for the last 10 years under the crisis of 2008. To put the long story short, Ukraine became very much stabilized. And this is something which was quite surprising and unexpected to Putin and to Russia. At that time, Russia also went through several crises. Political crisis, there was a crisis, the conflicts between Yeltsin as a president and the Russian parliament, who was governed by the Russian communists. You may remember it came to clashes on the street on October 1994. There were some victims that Putin sent tanks to Russian parliament. It was kind of civil war for a while, so to say. And there was the economic situation was very poor. So to put long story short, Russia didn't have either time or skills or possibility to deal with Ukraine. They focused much on the Russian issues. So therefore, Ukraine has some kind of breathing space. So what was there? Probably one significant element that in 1997, there was a signed Russian-Ukrainian agreement on the Black Sea fleet. And Yeltsin, in his very demagogical style, said that since then, every Russian official had to start every morning with the question, what have I done to Ukraine? This was the message. So what I'm saying here, there was no clear-cut strategy toward Ukraine. This was the story. And the Russian position was rather ambivalent. And my claim is, again, the situation didn't change radically when Putin replaced Yeltsin as the next Russian president. It looked like at the very beginning of the first term, Ukraine didn't exist for Putin as an issue. According to Illarionov, Putin started paying a special attention on Ukraine during the summer of 2001, on the second year of his first term in office. So at that time, he was invited by 𝗔𝘁𝗁 to join official celebrations of baptism of Rus, Хрещення Руси. On that occasion, they both visited Crimea. And then Putin and 𝗔𝘁𝗁 participated at the opening of the newly reconstructed Vladimir Cathedral that was destroyed during the Second World War. It was very much the symbolical place for Russian historical memory, especially during the Crimean War, because this is a kind of sacred space in the sense. But this was the place of the ancient Greek colony of Chersones, and where, according to legend, the Kyiv Prince Volodymyr was baptized and also started baptism of Rus. The whole ceremony opening this kind of cathedral impressed Putin very much. According to Illarionov, who was also present during this event, it dawned on Putin that he, as the Russian president, entitled to a special mission. And this mission to restore the former glory and glamour of Rus. And he felt a special link to the Kyiv Prince Volodymyr, because he was Vladimir himself. More so, it's also the name of his father. He was Vladimir Vladimirovich. So he was twice Vladimir. So this is kind of a very much direct connection. I know it's funny, but this is the way he thought, at least what Illarionov tells the story. Because this is kind of sudden. It's like a elevation. They quite discovered he has a special mission. The special missions come with this visit to Crimea. The next development was that a month later, he visited Ukraine again. This time to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Ukrainian independence, against the invitation of 𝗔𝘁𝗁. We don't know whereabouts of the Putin earliest biography. It's very much, so to say, covered. We don't know his biography, by the way. It's very much secret. So we don't know the whereabouts, but it appears that this was the first time he ever visited Kyiv. He never been to Kyiv before. So this was first visit. According again to Illarionov, Kyiv impressed him very much. He never seen such a beauty. He was especially impressed by glamour of medieval churches like Sofia. And that increased his will to bring Ukraine back to Russia. So like momentarily, during summer 2001, with his revelations, there's a special mission to restore Russia, and on the condition to bring Ukraine back, including Kyiv, to his space. This is what Illarionov claimed. So I said that at that time Leronov was Putin advisor. We don't have any proofs to corroborate veracity of these claims. However, I would say that this story was corroborated by the later events. Again, you may remember or not, because this is not this long history. The COVID and then the war changed a lot of the things that we remember nowadays. But in 2002, the Russian Secret Service, FSB, took special efforts to destroy the reputation of 𝗂𝘁𝘁. They spread the news that 𝗂𝘁𝘁 has allegedly sold 𝗂𝘁𝘁𝗃 radars to a sanctioned Iraq. It was the fake news, but 𝗂𝘁𝘁 was left isolated by the international community. None of the leaders of any big countries wanted to deal with him. Evidently, Kremlin was very happy with this, because it means that 𝗂𝘁𝘁 could be very vulnerable and could be dictated conditions by Putin. But 𝗂𝘁𝘁, however, did not abandon his hopes of restoring his relationship with the West. And on this occasion, it's very important, dating is very important here. For the first time, he started to talk about Ukraine joining NATO. He was aware of this of FSB, actually. So he started to, because by that time he has a kind of ambivalent position to keep a simple position, keeping distance both to Russia and to Europe, to balance this kind. Now it changed. Now he declared that Ukraine has ambition to join the NATO, and even signed the Partner for Peace program between Ukraine and NATO. As a result, the isolation has been broken. In August of 2003, Ukrainian peacekeeping forces made their way to Iraq and Kuwait, and in response, George Bush Jr. promised Ukraine his support for helping Ukraine on her way to Euro-Atlantic political structure. So this was another breaking point, because this rapprochement with NATO led to an unprecedented escalation of Russian-Ukraine relations, so-called 𝗠𝘁𝘁𝗃 conflict. So this is the story, which is kind of complicated. I'll try to probably give a simple version. So on the September of 2003, right several months after 𝗂𝘁𝘁 signed this agreement with NATO, Putin has vacation, and he spent his vacation in Sochi. His was favorite place. By the way, it was where Olympic Games were held. So during his stay in Sochi, Putin convened a summit of Kazakhstan, Russian and Ukrainian president to sign agreements of a common economic space, which is kind of counteract to the European ambition of Ukraine. And 𝗂𝘁𝘁 was not willing to sign, and he didn't show up. After the meeting, which 𝗂𝘁𝘁 was absent, Putin visited a neighboring Black Sea shore. Sochi is very close to sea. And he was told that there was no clear demarcation sea line between Russia and Ukraine. There was a small island, 𝗠𝘁𝘁, that was on Ukrainian side, but its status was disputed. Putin ordered to build a dam between the Russian seashore and island, and thus annexed the latter by the fait accompli. The construction work started without any announcement and proceeded with amazing speed. The Ukrainian border guard was brought into alert because of this break of the border. At that time, 𝗂𝘁𝘁 was on official visit to South America. During his stay in Argentina, he received a call informing him on the border conflict with Russia. 𝗂𝘁𝘁 instantly canceled his visit, returned to Ukraine, and proceeded directly to 𝗠𝘁𝘁. At the meantime, he was trying to call Putin, but Putin didn't respond. And the Russian administration said that he was nowhere to find. Then 𝗂𝘁𝘁 ordered Ukrainian guards that if Russian works would continue, would not stop, the guards should shoot directly the aggressors. And then quite suddenly, Putin reappeared. He called 𝗂𝘁𝘁 and inquired what was going on. He pretended he was not aware of this incident. He blamed local authorities and put all the responsibility on them. And this is the first time when Ukraine and Russia found themselves on the brink of military conflict, 2003, which was the kind of another event. I'll probably tell you later about how it has impact on the Ukrainian society. So actually, this was evidently that Russian-Ukrainian relations got a new turn, and the turn becoming much more antagonistic. And the architect of this turn was this man, Nobody knows him. I remember him, luckily enough. The name is Alexander Voloshin. He was a head of Russian administration, of the Putin administration. According to Leonov, it was him that orchestrated the Putin turns toward Ukraine. Voloshin stood at the origins of politics until his resignation in October 2003, when he protested against Khodorkovsky arrest, but he was the one who persuaded Putin to shift his focus from great geopolitics to a close neighborhood, so-called 𝗔𝘁𝘁𝗶𝗀 and Ukraine was the closest, so to say. It was a very short period, probably 2 years, and finally Voloshin has resigned, again, just let me mention, as a protest against Mikhail Khodorkovsky arrest, but his resignation didn't stop the whole trend. But now it looks a new trend, and this is a new turn, and the first time this turn got a historical perspective. This is the first time when Putin started to use historical memory as a tool to legitimate his aggression on Ukraine. It was so-called 𝗨𝗶𝗿𝗀. I wonder if you ever heard about this, but it's very important. For those who are not professional, they know about this portion of this 𝗨𝗶𝗿. 𝗨𝗶𝗿 is a small provincial town in North Russia. It's a neighborhood of Novgorod. According to the primary chronicle, it was there where the Scandinavian tribe of Rus, under leadership of Rurik, head of the clan, started their conquest of the neighboring lands. And it was the beginning of Rus. Because it started from 𝗨𝗶𝗿, 𝗨𝗶𝗿 could be considered as the primary capital of Rus, not Kyiv. So this is the whole idea. The idea was restore 𝗨𝗶𝗿 in order to show that Russia has older and better claims to legacy of Rus than Kyiv, that Kyiv is Russia's latecomer. Specifically for this reason, Putin visited 𝗨𝗶𝗿. It was orchestrated, it was kind of finely orchestrated. He sailed there on his own yacht. And if you notice this kind of picture, rare picture of this Rurik visits this region, it was strictly repetition of this whole scheme. Like Rurik visiting the 𝗨𝗶𝗿, now Putin is visiting 𝗨𝗶𝗿. So it was kind of the direct link. In 𝗨𝗶𝗿, Putin visited a former 𝗨𝗶𝗿 fortress that was turned into Orthodox monastery. He also participated in the local archaeological excavations led by a Petersburg professor, Andrei 𝗫𝗁𝗁. Luckily enough, he didn't find anything because it was later they started to find all the kind of archaeological excavations, Greek artifacts, all the kind of thing. But the whole story is, he visited 𝗨𝗶𝗿, he spent there 2 days, and he was not impressed. He summarized his speech by a very short phrase: this is not Kyiv. So the aim and target of the Ukrainian politics was defined. It was Kyiv, no less. So the Putin visit to 𝗨𝗶𝗿 took place, but there were new president elections in full swing. But that time, 𝗓𝗁 was ending his second term, and according to Ukrainian constitution, was obliged to step down from his presidential office. To his excuse, it must be said that he did everything possible to keep distance from Russia. To that effect, he even wrote, or rather authorized a book with a telling title, Ukraine is not Russia, Ukraina не Россия. But even though he tried to keep a distance from Russia, he was emulating Russian political patterns. Very much like Yeltsin appointing Putin his successor, 𝗓𝗁 chose Yanukovych. The reason of his choice remains unclear to this time. There are several interpretations, which probably cover the details later, if the questions emerges about this issue. But the most important thing is, Yanukovych was the most unlikely contender for the post of Ukrainian president. With his criminal past, it was like someone offering Al Capone to become American president. Still, nowadays, with victory of Trump, you could be surprised that much, so to say. But one of the reasoning is that since 𝗓𝗁 at the time was very much vulnerable, there was a lot of protest against 𝗓𝗁, so he was reliable on the Putin support, and this was the Putin who chose Yanukovych as a possible candidate for the Ukrainian presidency. In any case, Putin didn't even try to disguise his personal support for Yanukovych. He even congratulated him twice before the final elections, result was announced as a new Ukrainian president. Another story is that the Yanukovych campaign was run by Russian political operatives from the Kremlin, including 𝗨𝗵𝗶𝗀, who was the chief, and was marked by egregious misuse of administrative power and falsification. It was believed that Russian operatives regarded the Ukraine as a training ground for the upcoming Russian presidential elections. Among other things, Yushchenko, the main contender of Yanukovych, was poisoned by dioxin. And this was the practice that was later used by the Russian Secret Service against the Russian opposition, including Navalny. So therefore, they treated it like a real training ground for the later operations. So it didn't help. So the Yanukovych falsification led to mass protests in Kyiv, known as the Orange Revolution, and they brought Yushchenko to power. And this was a shock. This was a shock for Putin. We never really realized what kind of shock it was. So many who knows him said this was the most important turn in his political biography. The reason this is why I'm telling this, I will remind you about 𝗨𝗵𝗶𝗀. 𝗨𝗵𝗶𝗀 is born in Odessa. He spent his childhood and youthful year there. He moved in Odessa to Moscow in the 70s and never returned to Ukraine. And his image of Ukraine was defined by his childhood experience. So he believed that Ukraine is nothing else but another regional version of Russia. Because basically people are speaking Russians, they read Russian literature, they enjoy Russian culture, so this is just Russia. Ukraine is a very much formal construct, with one exception the Western Ukraine. Western Ukraine, the former Austrian and Polish part, which was less Russified and less Sovietized. And see, this is the only place that 𝗨𝗵𝗶𝗀 believed this very really kind of Ukrainian identity. But this is a clear minority. Once you isolate them, you could easily get control over the rest of Ukraine. And this is exactly the main tactics of the 𝗨𝗵𝗶𝗀 election politics in Ukraine. So this was exactly to divide Ukraine and giving the demographical preponderance of the Russian-speaking Eastern Ukraine. He believed this will give automatic victory for Yanukovych. And this was exactly the same image that was shared by Yeltsin and Gorbachev. How's the memories about one of the translator of the, probably no translator of the, who served as translator to Gorbachev, and he wrote his memoirs. He said exactly, Putin has believed that there is no real difference between Ukraine and Russia, with probably exception of Western Ukraine. This is kind of the larger consensus. So Ukraine is very much artificial nation. So if not this Western Ukraine nationalist and corrupt elites in Kyiv, Ukraine will easily fall under Russian controls. But once you isolate those two forces, you could easily get control over Ukraine. So what happened was the shock, because this concept didn't work. Because there's all the kind of efforts that were invested and money invested into Ukrainian campaign, Yanukovych lost the elections. And 𝗨𝗨𝗶𝗀 chose the simplest explanation. The failure was the result of the plot made by the West. If not intrusion by the West, Russia would easily won and Yanukovych this election. And this interpretation played perfectly into Putin's perception, because that's exactly how Putin thought about Ukraine. As every autocrat, he doesn't believe in spontaneous mass protest. He saw them as a plot organized from outside. In his understanding, the victory of colorful revolution in Georgia and Ukraine meant that the West has advanced in his closest courtyard. It was a turning point in the Putin mindset. According to Catherine Belton, the American journalist who wrote a book based on interviews with the Putin milieu, Putin thought to resign. He was so shocked, devastated, and scared that he believed he could not take any responsibility for the further developments. He remained because the fact was that no one in his inner circle wanted to take his place, because this was immense responsibility. So what I'm saying, this is kind of a shocking event which defines the later attitude, definitely defines the later attitude toward Ukraine, because nowadays Putin started to treat Ukraine as a direct danger, existential danger for his personal regime and the very courtyard of Russia. So Putin decided to counteract. In 2008, he started the war with Georgia. His military success gave him wings, and the weak reaction of the West to his military aggression built his confidence that he could proceed easily with Ukraine as the way he proceeded with Georgia. By the end of this year, Kremlin developed and accepted a new military doctrine toward Ukraine. And this is something very important because, again, this is something that which people are mostly unaware, but I believe this is a crucial episode. Again, as I'm saying, this doctrine has been elaborated and accepted by the end of this year in the Kremlin. In the core of this doctrine was a premise that once Ukraine kept alienating herself from Russia, she should be punished by a full-scale military aggression. The military aggression should lead to partition of Ukraine. Partition is very important. Not occupation, but partition of Ukraine. So the Russian-speaking east and south, the line Kherson-Uman, has to be annexed directly to Russia under the name of New Russia. And this New Russia would block Ukraine access to Black Sea shore. The whole Black Sea shore from Mariupol to Odessa should be taken under full control of Russia. Again, this was something we emphasized. Odessa is the main target of Putin. You have to be remembered. He always constantly said about Odessa as the Russian city. Also, the next target was industrial heart of Ukraine, which is Dnipro and Kharkiv. It would become a part of Russia as a new annexed territory. The Western Ukraine, in the opinion of Putin, is too toxic, too nationalistic. He believes that Stalin made a huge mistake by annexing this territory. Because if not the Baltic states, if not the Western Ukraine, that was part of Soviet Union, probably Soviet Union would be existed longer. Because this was the part of the anti-communist opposition, separatists, all that kind of things. So he didn't want to repeat this mistake. In Putin's opinion, Western Ukraine might go whatever it wants, even to the devil, which means Poland and Hungary. What would be left of Ukraine, as a smaller Ukraine, the central part, it will be a vassal state with a puppet regime in Kyiv, with a president very loyal to Moscow, something like a new version of Lukashenko and Belarus. So this was the plan. Very important was the reasoning. Why this plan has been accepted. First, the timing, because Ukraine was not returning. The time was ticking. There's already 17 years, and Ukraine was tilting toward the West. And Putin and his spin doctor realized that whoever will come to power in Ukraine, either from western part as Kravchuk or from the eastern part as Kuchma, they will move Ukraine toward the West. And Russia would lose Ukraine sooner or later. And Kuchma proved it. And secondly, probably more importantly, and this is timing very important here, because they believe this is the last chance to bring Ukraine back. Because they calculate, and I was right at that since the Ukraine depends on 17 years, there emerged a new generation of Ukrainians who has been born even before the collapse of the Soviet Union or after, which have very weak or no memory about the Soviet Union. Probably they could be either Russian-speaking or Ukrainian-speaking, doesn't really matter, but they don't have close affinity to Russia, and they want to live the same standards as they appears in the Poland, Hungary, or in Western country. So the calculation was, or fear of Putin was, that once this generation would reach a certain age of 30s, 40s, they would come to power, and this will be the end. That Ukraine will reach the point of no return. So therefore, the timing was very important. The time was ticking. This is now or never. So this is why they decided to have this kind of plan. Luckily enough, first of all, Russia was not militarily prepared because it has to take military preparations to build industry, to build army. And secondly, strangely enough, Ukraine was saved by the fact that in 2010, Yanukovych returned to power. And this renewed Putin's expectations that there are another way to bring Ukraine back to Russia, more peaceful manner, so to say. So basically, for a while, Ukraine was saved. But then in 2013, again, quite unexpectedly, very much like 𝗪𝘁𝘁, Yanukovych make a U-turn. He announced that he wanted to sign agreement with the European Union. And it just sent a signal to Putin again. So what, I will skip this part because know what followed. Because at the final moment, Yanukovych changed his mind again. He refused to sign agreement. And his refusal followed after his visit to Moscow. People who knew Yanukovych said that they never seen him so afraid. When he left the plane from Moscow, he was very pale. He was really a coward, this kind of, so he looked very macho. He was really a cowardice person. But the speculation was that during this meeting with Yanukovych, Putin has relieved his plans about military aggression. So if Yanukovych would sign this agreement, the military aggression would follow immediately. As a matter of fact, these plans were known before. This plan has leaked to the West and has been published in one of the Italian magazines that focus on geopolitics, Limes. I've seen this journal, I checked this article, and it was republished in leading Ukrainian newspaper, 𝗪𝘂𝘁𝗁𝗍. And there was a huge article published by two leading specialists in the intelligence service. One of them was no other but Vladimir Gorbulin, very intelligent person, by the way, Russian-speaking Russians from Dnipro, who was at that time the head of the РНБО, and the very title, 𝗪𝘁𝘁𝘁𝗲𝗿𝘀 𝗪𝘁𝘁𝘁 что Украина делать дальше. The big neighbor has made his decision, which means Russia, what Ukraine has to act or to do. And they described this plan in details. It's all partition, military aggression. It was 2009. But at that time, this plan looked so fantastic, nobody wanted to believe it. So nobody take it seriously. But the story now, still this plan was known in the West. And this was corroborated by the later scandal that occurred in Poland. It was during the Euromaidan. At that time, the foreign minister of the Foreign Affairs, Radek Sikorski, revealed some details from previous meetings in Moscow with Putin. And this was the meeting that we had Putin had with Sikorski and the Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk. According to Sikorski, during this meeting, Putin has said, Ukraine is an artificial country and Lviv is a police city, the capital of Western Ukraine. Why don't you just sort it out together? Luckily enough, Tusk didn't respond because he knew he was recorded. This was revelation made by Sikorski. Poland boiled over in outrage. Why had Sikorski and Tusk not made this public at that time? As a matter of fact, they did to Ukraine. They don't understand this message. Under pressure of scandal, Sikorski had to disavow his revelations. Still, the information was true. It was confirmed by Edward Lucas. You may remember his name. At that time, he was a chief editor of Economist. Lucas revealed that Poland, along with Estonia and a handful of other countries, did warn Ukraine and the West on the Putin plans and this talk. This warning came through diplomatic channels and the numerous off-the-record sessions of Security Conference and think tank. The problem was not that Poland didn't pass on Putin's sinister remarks to the West. The problem was that the Western leaders didn't grasp the significance. They choose not to believe these plans. I have my own experience. I remember that on 2012, I was visited in Lviv by American political scientist Kagan. He went to Lviv and to Kyiv to tell us directly about this plan, that we have been warned. So he knew this plan. Also, my friend, close friend, who worked with Poroshenko, in 2013, he visited the conference of European security in Warsaw. And he came to present these Putin plans in details. And he was mocked and ridiculed by the audience because they believe sci-fi. But during his break, one German ambassador, diplomat, approached him and said, he knows this is the truth. This the plan exists and this is the true plan. What I'm saying here that this was a kind of knowledge, and this is part of my personal experience because when the Euromaidan started, quite of a sudden, I just didn't plan that. I found myself ad hoc think tank that worked for Poroshenko. Poroshenko was on the leader. And we had one of the members of the team, exactly the person who also wrote this article for 𝗔𝘁𝘁𝗄, Alexander Litvinenko. He's a very remarkable figure. He is doctor of mathematics, who graduated from Moscow University and worked for a while in Russian FSB as a decipherer. And since he has a very good connection to Moscow, he kept this connection and he moved to Kyiv. So he knew all the kind of very detailed information, so to say. And we know at that time when we work in this ad hoc that Yanukovych is no longer a problem for Ukraine. The problem is Putin. We knew that aggression would follow and have time until the end of the Sochi Olympics game. And this is exactly what happened. On the next day, the Sochi Olympics is finished. The Crimean annexation of Crimea started. Yanukovych fled the country. It was the beginning of the unannounced war. The part of the Russian plan was that military aggression would require that much efforts, because since a large territory of Ukraine, particularly east and south of Ukraine, are Russian-speaking, they must be pro-Russians, and once Russian army would enter this territory, it would be met by flowers. And people would celebrate the Russian annexation. So this plan was called Russian Spring. The Russian Spring was supposed to bring anti-Maidan protest in large cities, and they have to took power of the large cities, and this will be very quick because it must be during the springtime. So Maidan ended by the end of February. For 3 months. This whole annexation plan has to come into fulfillment. It never happened. As a matter of fact, most of the Russian speakers didn't want to invite war in their home, and they are very resistant, and probably one of the most important episode was at the front of resistance was Dnipro, the largest industrial center in Ukraine, Dnipropetrovsk, a turf from Brezhnev, Kuchma, and 𝗂𝘁𝘁𝗀, the biggest Russian-Ukrainian oligarch of Jewish origin, who himself headed the opposition to the Russian aggression, so to say. So this is what quite unexpectedly happened. So the Russian spring of 2014 turned into summer, dragged on through the autumn, and was completely spent by the end of December. And Russian conquest were Crimea and part of Donbass region. And even in Donbass, local separatism was not spontaneous surprising. It required an invasion of Russian special forces headed by Girkin. My guess is that if not Russian intervention, relations between Donbass and Kyiv would have remained tense, but most unlikely would lead to a war. In any case, and this has to be mentioned, the separation of Donbass was rather a minimal achievement compared to Russia's ambitious plans to divide Ukraine and turn to the vassal state. If I say it's a small fry. So there were expectations, and this was naive expectation, I share these expectations. The failure of the Russian Spring would teach Putin a lesson, and he would give up with his military plans for Ukraine. So we proved to be wrong. These expectations were wrong. Those who knew Putin said that he is a very spiteful and vengeful person. Very much like a French Bourbon dynasty, had forgotten nothing but learned nothing. He persisted in his thinking that Ukraine is an artificial nation that is doomed to fail. And behind this spiteful persistence lurks this basic misunderstanding of Ukrainian identity. He falsely believes that Ukrainian identity is defined mostly by Ukrainian language. And since significant part of Ukrainians speak Russians, they must be Russians or pro-Russians. In other words, Putin presumes that Ukrainian identity has ethnic character, and it's limited to the Western Ukraine only. He and his spin doctors are ignoring the basic fact that since beginning of Ukrainian independence, Ukrainian identity has evolved from ethnic to civic concept. Just to show you this radical transformation, I would like to turn your attention to this kind of the screenshot from video that became very viral at the beginning of the war. You may remember this episode. At the very beginning of the war, Zelensky and his men were standing in the courtyard of the presidential office in Kyiv and saying, "We are here, and we protect independence, and we're not regarding to move out of the country." I wonder if you watch closely to this picture, because the text is a lot. First of all, out of these 5 persons, only 2 are Ukrainians. So this is 𝗏𝗁 and Podolyak. 𝗏𝗁 is the head of the vice prime minister, and the Podolyak is his advisor to Putin. 2 other, Zelensky, and he's the head of his advice office, as head of the administration, are Yermak, of Jewish origin. The 5th one, Arachame, is a Georgian. 1 person who is missing is the Ministry of the Defense, and he is Reznikov. He is a Jew from Russia, from Lviv. I interviewed him, and he said that he realized that he is Ukrainian only when he was 21, and the impact of the Orange Revolution. He chose this Ukrainian identity. At that time, he was the Minister of Defense. Like Yermak and Zelensky was of Jewish origin. And later on, 2023, he was replaced by Rustim Umerov, who is Crimean Tatar. So give the idea. All of them are Ukrainians of very various origins. And this is clear civic identity. And I bet most of them speak home Russian language. It's clear that Zelensky learned Ukrainian very much like 𝗓𝘁𝗁 before them, and even Yanukovych. This was the sense. So this was not their native language. Another important characteristic, which is probably not noticed to you, is generation dimension. All these people here, average age is 40-some, 45. And this is directly this generation that Putin was scared of the emergence, and they came to power. And by the way, this is average age of the soldiers in the front. This is a new generation, so-called the generation of independence. There's a different kind of values and behavior. Most importantly, most of them, they came not from the administration, or like Kravchuk, or like 𝗓𝘁𝗁, or not from the all-industrial base like Kravchuk. All of them came from service sectors. They either IT, or TV, or mass media, all the kind of things, which means they have no part in the biography that's related to the state. So this is something this is a new middle urban class that emerged in the 20s, in the last 20 years, and came to power everywhere. And they're 40s. It's very important to compare the average age of 𝗓𝘁𝗁 or Zelensky milieu and the Putin and his milieu. The average age of Putin milieu is 70-some. The average age of the Zelensky is 40-some. It's like a fathers and sons. And this explains the generational difference. I wonder if you notice that former leaders of Ukraine, like Tymoshenko or Poroshenko or Yushchenko, they're relatively young. They're my age. I'm not even young, but politicians very young. 60. It's not the age of Trump or Biden or Yanukovych. Even they, in their 60s, look like they're dinosaurs in Ukrainian politics. In my understanding, they have no chance to repeat, because this is generation taking power everywhere. Each sector of Ukrainian society nowadays is headed by this generation. And the most important, very part is another part. Mostly, this is more and more there's the ladies there. That nowadays Ukraine, this generation has a very feminine face. So what I'm saying here, this is something which Putin, luckily enough, fails to understand. Because otherwise, he'll understand that, probably he would get a much more sophisticated strategy toward Ukraine. So what I just said, there emerged 3 conclusions, and I'm coming to the final part. The first one relates to Putin's motives. There were several explanations why Putin started the war. The experts named geopolitical, demographical, economical reasons, and I bet you're familiar with 𝗏𝗏 thesis, all the kind of things. This was very pragmatic reasons. I beg to differ. There's not much pragmatism beyond the Putin decision. The chronology of Putin's evolution toward Ukraine suggests another view. Behind various pragmatic motives, there was one major of ideological character, and namely, the visions of Ukraine as an artificial nation and an unsustainable state. So what I'm saying here, this comes from the very beginning of the Ukrainian independence, because this is a general perception that's shared by most of Russian elites nowadays, even nowadays. In a sense, Russian elites never give a full consent on Ukraine as a nation separate of Russia. Lack of this consent doesn't mean that Russian military aggression could not be avoided. It could. The decision to start the war was largely his personal responsibility. I believe there was some tension between the two states, probably gas war or tax war, whatever, but not military aggression. Military aggression was still kind of product of the Putin decision. Still, what mattered is that lack of such consent on Ukraine independence made the decision of Putin much more probable. It leads me to a second conclusion. Quite often this perspective on Ukraine as artificial nation is presented by the Russian intellectuals, politicians of the liberal creeds. At the very beginning of the presentation, I referred to the decision that was made on Ukraine in the Yeltsin milieu. According to 𝗨𝗸𝗿𝗶𝗀, this decision was presented by Galina Starovoitova. Again, those who was living at the time of the Soviet Union, they remember this name, was very much famous name. She was a specialist on the ethnic relations in the Soviet Union, very outspoken lady, very sympathetic lady, and she was assassinated in 1991 and became a symbol of crashed Russian liberalism. But still, she shared the same view on Ukraine as an artificial nation. The episode about Starovoitova was told by 𝗨𝗪𝗶𝗀. As I mentioned, he was born in Odessa. He moved to Moscow and became advisor to 𝗪𝗿𝗀. In 2008, he wrote an article on the Ukrainian politics of memory under Yushchenko. And the main thrust of his article was an advice to Putin how to keep Ukraine within Russian world until she could not reach the point of no return. So in being so sympathetic to Ukraine, he still gives advice how to keep Ukraine as much closer to Russia as possible. 𝗧𝗶𝗺, in his turn, was advisor to 𝗪𝗿𝗀. Attitude of 𝗪𝗿𝗀 to Putin is very complicated. Still 2015, shortly before his death, and 4 years after the Crimea annexation, 𝗪𝗿𝗀 stated that Putin was exactly the leader Putin badly needed. I won't talk about Pavlovsky because I told about it, but choose the attention to Alexander Voloshin, who was the architect of the Putin's turn toward Ukraine. And Voloshin is considered to be a systematic liberal. As again, let me remind you, he resigned in protest for the arrest of the Khodorkovsky. And still, he was architect of the Russian aggression toward Ukraine. I'm not claiming that all rebels like that. There are some exceptions, like 𝗪𝗺𝗁, who was killed 6 years ago, or probably somebody else that we know, like Kasparov. Kasparov didn't say this kind of thing, but they are in minority. Shortly before his death, Gleb Pavlovsky condemned the war, and he really repented. And his former associate, Marat Gelman, who served as a Russian spin doctor during the night of the revolution, nowadays collects money for Ukrainian army. But still, it's a rather minor episode. What I meant to say, that there has been a broad consensus among Russian elites that Ukraine should be reintegrated in Russian space, and this consensus extends to Russian liberals. They couldn't be blamed directly for the Putin aggression against Ukraine. Still, they contribute to the general atmosphere that was inducive to Russian war against Ukraine. And it stares very stark contrast to Polish elites. Right after World War II, Polish liberals who found themselves outside the communist Poland in the immigration, they were discussing the status of Western Ukraine and Lviv, my native city, and also Lithuania and Vilnius. This was territory that was part of the interwar Poland before the war, and was annexed by the Soviet Union after the war. So they became, Poland has lost these territories. And there was discussion what will be politics of the future Polish state once the Polish would be liberated from communism. What will be kind of the attitude politics to this kind of the lost territories, so-called eastern borderlands, Kresy. The crucial idea was articulated by the Paris-based journal Kultura, which was very, at that time, influential. It probably has the best publication, standard publication of the Polish novels, poetry, and also as a kind of the sector on the political thought. So the Jacyk, who was the chief editor of this magazine, made a radical proposal in 1951. He said verbatim, for the benefit of Poland, Poles should agree and admit that Vilnius is a Lithuanian city and Lviv is a Ukrainian city, and never try to claim this is a Polish territory. At that time, this proposal drew sharp criticism from the Polish government in exile in London and the Polish diaspora. You could easily imagine what happened, because this would have been treason. For them, giving up Lviv and Vilnius was tantamount to national treason. However, the parish-based Kultura was very popular among the anti-communist Solidarność movement that emerged in the 80s. Once this movement in late 1989 came to power, this was the first time break of the communist regime. This is the first time that communist country there was opposition that came to power. They adopted this so-called Gedős doctrine as a part of their platform. And there is a very particular episode which I like to tell you, because this is particular episode was told by a member. It's not very well known. It's also part of the oral history. So on the night between the 1st and the 2nd December, when there was a Ukrainian referendum held that has to corroborate Ukrainian independence, and there was the first election of a Ukrainian president. So that night, the president of Poland, which was the former leader of the opposition, Lech Wałęsa, together with his two close advisors, Adam Michnik and Jacyk, they kept a vigil in the president's palace for a whole night, keeping themselves alert with some drinks. They don't define what kind of drinks they were. They were waiting for the results of Ukrainian referendum to be announced, because their ambition was they wanted Polish would be independent, to be the first country in the world to recognize Ukraine. They were very much worried that Canada, with its large Ukrainian population, will be the first to accept, to recognize. And they beat Ukraine, they beat Canada exactly by 5 minutes. But for them it was a very important message. They have no claims against Ukraine, and we see Ukraine as strategically important ally. Nowadays, the Ukrainian-Polish relations are in crisis. Still, it seems that whoever comes to power, either in Kyiv or Warsaw, they'll see each other as strategical partners in the face of the Russian threat. So what I'm saying here, Ukrainians badly need a Russian 𝗪𝘂𝘁, or Russian Michnik, or Russian 𝗁. Somebody who said that for the benefit of the Russian who's to accept that Crimea and Donbass is Ukraine. So far, it never happened. They have no kind of clear statement that respects the territorial integrity of Ukraine, even among Russian opposition. Such a statement looks nowadays beyond bounds of possible, and so is the peace and reconciliation with Russia. And finally, let me return to where I started. The statement that the beginning of the war largely defines the way it ends. There has been a long discussion of what is in the Putin head. And there is a very good book. I strongly suggest you to read it, like Michel Elchanino, Vladimir Putin had, like Timothy Snyder, The Road to Freedom, and specifically Spin Doctors, written by Gurillo. It's an excellent book, which I try to somehow to decipher, to come out decipher how the ways of the Putin and his elite thinks. But they're all discussing what Putin has read and who influences his mindset. And among these putative authors, they claim they may be Russian pro-fascist thinker Ivan Ilyin, Carl Schmitt, authoritarian conservative theorist and member of Nazi Party, or even Zbigniew Brzezinski. Those who knew Putin closely claim that we should not overestimate his intellectual abilities. He is not an avid reader. His philosophy comes not from book, but his hobby. And his hobby is judo. Judo is a sport that has been practiced since his youth. As they say in Russia, sila есть, ума не надо, which is roughly could be translated, once you have a strength, you don't need intelligence. The truth must be told, Putin is very weak in strategy. He is strong, though, in plotting tactical operations. And his tactics come from judo, and this means in judo, you stay close to your opponents and wear them down until they give up. So you should stop your efforts. So what I'm saying here, despite his failure to achieve his goals to 14, Putin abandoned nothing. The full-scale invasion confirms this. So, coming to potential Polish-Russian-Ukrainian negotiations, truce and peace. My claim is that truce would resolve very little, if anything. According to Alexander Litvinenko, the name I just mentioned before, This nowadays, he is the leader of the Ukrainian Foreign Intelligence Service. And by the way, he appears very seldomly publicly, but once you see the interview public, you have to believe this is something very important he has to say. So he made this kind of statement a year ago, and according to him, that Kremlin believes that returning of Ukraine is possible only as a part of a global distribution of the world, and such distribution could last 10, 15 years, up to 2040. And this would be accompanied by conflicts of varying scale, intensity, possibly even with the use of nuclear weapons. Moreover, the war against Ukraine is perceived by the Kremlin as important, but not the only front for Russia. Because basically Putin believes that he's not waging war against Ukraine, he's waging war against West on the Ukrainian territory. And he's undermined the West as the whole. I tend to believe accuracy of Litvinenko. As I said, he's not a public figure. He makes a public appearance very rarely, but he has really something to say, and he was exactly the man who wrote about the military plans of Putin to. So I could testify his professional skills, but also could tell from my craft of historian. If he is to teach us anything, one of its lessons is this: you cannot appease an aggressor with ambitious and long-term plans. Ukraine learned this lesson hard way. Prior to the full-scale invasion of 2022, we were warned about the war, but we want to believe it. It is probably human nature to mobilize only once a threat becomes real. I would love to be wrong, but my historian guts tells me that in February 2022, the world entered into the decade of war. So as the ancient Latin saying says, if you want peace, prepare for the war, this saying remains as relevant after 3 years of war in Ukraine as it has been for the last 2,000 years. Thank you so much.
Dr. Hrytsak, thank you so much for taking us along on that very important journey back to 1991. I'm sure that we have very, very many questions. We've been very attentive. Maybe I can take a liberty and ask you the first question, and I have very many now brewing in my head. Over the last 3 years, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we've been observing over the linguistic change which has come along with how we describe the war. We've all started referring to the war first as Putin's war. Soon enough, we've learned to move on to describe the war as Russia's war. Your lecture had brought us back to that question, at least in my head, whether this is the right way to look at what is going on. And my second part to this question, if anybody else in Russia as powerful as Putin out there, ready to take over in case something happens to the man?
I will be speculating here, because there is no ground for provide some kind of the answer. But speculation is this: it would be hardly a Russian opposition who will take a power once the Putin regime would collapse. Most likely, this will be somebody from the closest Putin milieu. Very much like after the death of Stalin. There'll probably show of some kind of the conflicts who will take the power after that, but basically they will say that we are not guilty, this is him. And they proceed as nothing really happened. And the key question is whether West and Ukraine would accept this kind of solution. If Trump was still in power by that time, I'll be this very plausible scenario. But I don't expect some kind of the radical change on the Russian elites. I mean, they probably stop the war. That said, I don't believe so far in the possibility of Polish or Russian-Ukrainian reconciliation. Because to start reconciliation, there must be some entry tickets for reconciliation. And the first entry tickets, they have to say that we are sorry. Like what has happened with Germany. They have to accept responsibility. Without this entry ticket, nothing could happen. So I say, for a long time, even so there will be probably some truce or peace, Ukraine and Russia would remain very much antagonistic country with very much negative image of each other. So this is probably a new reality.
Could you comment on the influence of Alexander Dugin on Putin's thinking about this conflict?
Again, this is not my opinion, it's expert science. It's very much overrated, very much overrated. Dugin is pretending to be very important, he's not.
There are many theories about Trump. One, obviously, is that he's a Russian agent. Other theories are also there. And now, one theory that has come forward is that Trump is going to back Putin because Trump himself has imperialist ambitions towards Panama, Greenland, and even Canada. And so he would want Putin on his side. Has anybody in Ukraine heard of that theory?
Very much so. We don't buy this theory. We know that, we have a concern that actually that Trump has very much, claims has imperialist character, without a doubt. But it's not our main concern. Our main concern what would happen to Ukraine and the next, say, a special administration, because basically the three things that concern us is Patriots, Starlinks, and intelligence data. And so far, we are at risk. This is what we see. Because basically, this is the war of attrition. This war, attrition boils to the issue of resources. Who could stand longer with these resources? If Ukraine is left on its own, regardless how heroic Ukrainians will be, they have no chances. Because Russian resources 3-4 times bigger, higher than Ukraine's. But if Ukraine has access to Western resources, including United States, Russia has no chance to stand. So this is the point. And this is what concerns us because the West is breaking up. Because it seems like United States is leaving this space and Ukraine is left on its own with Europe, which now becomes very much united, extremely united around Ukraine. They were not scared about the war, but they start scared because of Putin. But we know, we are aware that Europe could not replace United States, at least for foreseeable future. So this is our concerns. So we're thinking different. We have a different perspective, so to say, because our perspective is existential threat, essential survival. Even so, we wish that Panama and Greenland and Canada will stay independent countries, very much like Ukraine.
In kind of continuation of that train of thought, and in light of recent events, with the American regime changing sides, abandoning the accepted Western peace of 80 years, is it possible that this is a prelude for a more of a three-pronged kind of world disruption where Ukraine is forced to capitulate, and that allows Putin to advance to the western border of Ukraine to attack Europe at the same time that the Trump regime decides to attack Canada and Greenland, at the same time as China attacks Taiwan, and because everybody is distracted by the chaos, is it possible that these dictators who have been flattering each other are actually kind of setting us up for, what they envision as a World War III, unfortunately?
Your question already presumes answer. Yes, it's possible. Everything is possible nowadays. This is the very simple answer, so to say. We are not sure that this turn, Putin-Trump turn, is a preemptive. That could be changed. We believe so, because you cannot predict Trump. One expectation is very much personal. He's a megalomaniac, and he's very much macho. He could hardly tolerate another macho, like Putin. So there will be a clash. Most likely, there are chances it could turn, but we never know. At least we've been told by the American experts in January. But then there came February, and it changed, but we'll know what would happen in March and April. It's quite unpredictable. But my short answer is that if I may provide some kind of the historical parallel, we are now in the 1938. It's not 39, but pretty close. So the question is whether we will be closer to 39 or we step back to 37 and 36. And this remains to be unanswered. But there is general consensus that this is not the final war, this is not the end of the war, because we're entering decade of war. War may erupt nowadays in any place, like Gaza, Taiwan, name it, so to say. So this is probably the new reality.
We have almost 100 people watching this lecture online, and we would like to ask 𝗪𝗂𝘁 to see whether any questions come in that way.
Thank you. We have one question coming in from 𝗪𝗂𝘁𝗁. Could you comment on the influence, if any, of Viktor Medvedchuk in Putin's thinking about Ukraine? Medvedchuk should have had a more realistic view of national feelings in Ukraine and support for Ukraine's sovereignty among both Ukrainian and Russian speakers than Putin. Yet Putin's decision to invade seemed to have been premised on the belief that Ukraine would fall quickly. What does this tell us about Medvedchuk, his views, and his influence on Putin's thinking? Thank you.
We really don't know what Putin thinks because we consider he is smarter than we think. But there is a problem. The problem is very similar like the final day of the Soviet Union with the KGB. Because KGB has a very much correct information what's going in the Soviet Union, but they failed to deliver it to the Brezhnev because they knew what Brezhnev was expecting. They didn't want to bring up bad news. So my expectation is that Medvedchuk was nurturing Putin with information that Putin was expecting, so to say. It's like a vicious circle, so to say. So this is what most probably would happen. But again, this is a guess. I wish that some days Medvedchuk be arrested again and start investigation of this revelation like they think, but I believe so. That's exactly what I'm saying here. You probably know this fact. Putin doesn't use internet. He's a very much KGB officer of old school. He reads all the documents printed on the paper. And this might be briefing prepared by his milieu. And they don't want him to bring bad news. Because otherwise, there is a risk involved. And this is good news for Ukraine, because he has a distorted picture. Very much like the Soviet Union by the end of the end. One of the reasons we collapsed, because they couldn't give the right information what was really going on. And they was nourishing their kind of the illusions, dreams, all the kind of things. So I believe this is the same case with Medvedchuk and Putin.
First of all, 𝗪𝗂𝘁, I thought that was a great lecture. I really appreciate it. I just wanted to raise one question about Russia. If you look at Russia in its independence period, in 1998 they had a huge financial crisis, almost collapsed. In 2008 to 9 they had another one. And the problem for Russia is that it's a petro state. It's highly reliant on high oil and gas prices, just like this province. And these are not really stable for any length of time. And if you look at its economy and you compare its economy with states of Europe, the economy is smaller than Italy. I mean, this is not a great power.
It's more or less the same.
More or less the same. It's not a great power in any sense other than the fact it has a large military and it's got nuclear weapons. And I think the nuclear weapons are the ultimate threat that Putin has against the neighbors. That if you interfere, if you fire missiles against Moscow, for example, we're going to resort to nuclear weapons. But in some ways it's a false threat, because if you ever go that far, then neither Russia nor the Western countries are going to last for very long. So it's a bluff, in a way, for me. And I've argued over and over again that the only way to end this war and keep Ukraine as an independent state is for Russia to be defeated, one way or another. It's not a matter of being warlike, and not wanting peace, but as you said, you sometimes have to get peace through warfare. And I don't think we should overestimate Russia or Putin.
I quite agree with you, David. Thank you for your kind words. Because basically, you're following the same way, the same amount of the information that I follow. Because basically, there are estimations that Russia has resources until the summer 26. The Russian economy is already overextended. So we could talk about 25, but what is 26, nobody really knows what could happen, so to say. So Russia is not stable. in any sense. What we know, and this would be told on many occasions by the experts, that surprisingly, the real deterrence factors that keep Russia from using the nuclear bomb, and actually there was some point, there was like a discussion, on the Kremlin supposedly to use nuclear bomb, tactical bomb, the main deterrence side is China. Because China realized the economical effects that the nuclear weapons would have on the market, including the Chinese. So if I say again, if there is somebody who would give a leverage on Putin in these negotiations, not Trump, it's China. Exactly because Russia depends very much on Russia and is turning in a settled state of China. And this is something which is that. Again, war of attrition is not result on the front line. This is something we have to remember. Because war attrition is very much like the First World War. Actually, First World War was a classical war attrition. If you remember, German army practically won the war on the Eastern Front and very was close to won the war on the Western Front. It was very close to Paris. But then what happened? It collapsed. Because basically war attrition ends with a collapse. And we believe that West, whatever it means by the West, held all possible leverage to bring Russia to collapse. But it's paradox, it's not willing to. Probably nowadays, probably too late, I don't know. Because given the size of the economy, given potentials, so to say, this is something which could not grasp. Why is that? Because we were counting very much at the very beginning. Because basically, we believe that chance for Russia to collapse was very high by the end of the first year, 22. If this will be kind of the kind of solution will be made, not in Kyiv, but in the West, in Brussels, in Washington. But we were explained without a doubt, the West doesn't want Ukraine to lose the war, but it doesn't want Russia to lose the war either. And this brought us to the dead end. And as such a dead end, Ukraine loses more than Russia. Again, it's a big question. Nowadays, is the competition between Russia and Ukraine who would collapse first? And the chances are equal, I would say.
We've talked a lot about strategies going forward. I wonder what you think is going to happen in the next few days. You've brought us right up to today. The next few days, the next few weeks. What are your opinions? What are your thoughts?
You would better ask historians what happened in the next 100 years. That I know for sure. You know, historians could not take such a risk to make any prognosis in a few years. Anything could happen, so to say. As I say, we could not make any prognosis until the war ends. When the war ends, we start explanation. We start to explain why it ends this way, not another. But before that, we are just helpless. I'm sorry to tell that. So recognize we have certain limits in our profession, our field. I cannot leave this space by thanking you for and expressing my gratitude for what you're doing for Ukraine. I know you're doing a lot. And please continue. We very much appreciate it, and we appreciate even much more once the war would end. Thank you so much.